It's divided the country, sent ripples of concern throughout the region and prompted international accusations of double standards. So what's behind the Indian-US nuclear deal? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. A controversial nuclear deal between the United States and India is being hailed as a milestone for the two countries, once on opposite sides of the Cold War fence. Well, the deal would allow India to import US nuclear fuel and reactors. In exchange, India will place its civilian reactors under international safeguards. But inside India, there's a rift in the ruling coalition. The communists oppose the deal, claiming it will give Washington too much influence over India. The debate has led to open speculation that the government may fall, bringing early elections. Mohammed Val has the story.
The head of the World Nuclear Watchdog was welcomed in India, a non-signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The visit was described as routine, but its timing is significant. The countdown has begun for the final endorsement of a controversial nuclear cooperation deal between New Delhi and Washington. And the International Atomic Energy Agency could be given a supervisory role. Indian and American leaders hailed the deal as the foundation of a new strategic partnership. Decades of political and ideological estrangement between them seem to have never existed. According to the deal, the US will supply India with nuclear fuel and technology and enable New Delhi to expand its nuclear power program, while the US is said to be looking for more than just economic benefits. India could be a strategic partner in a region where the United States wants to contain other powers, not only Pakistan, but also China. But the deal is facing tough criticism in many quarters. In the US, some fear it will reverse 3 decades of American anti-proliferation policy by rewarding a country that has refused to sign international non-proliferation accords and tested nuclear weapons. Others see in it an instance of double standards in the light of American opposition to Iranian and North Korean nuclear programs. In the region, and especially in Pakistan, the arch-enemy and rival of India, the deal is raising fears of a new arms race that could lead to a nuclear war. Internally in India, the deal is threatening to break down the ruling coalition. The communists say the pact would undermine New Delhi's nuclear weapons program and allow the United States to interfere in Indian affairs. Mohammed Val, Al Jazeera.
So what does the deal mean for each country? Well, the United States wants to court India as a strategic ally and partner to help contain China. There's also the prospect of developing joint military capabilities. And US companies would, of course, benefit from better access to India's economy and could make money by selling nuclear technology. And Washington claims engaging with India makes the world safer. Well, what about India on the other hand? Well, it would have access to technology for new, better and bigger nuclear reactors. It could source more uranium, which is scarce, and thus produce more energy to meet the demands of its booming economy. And like the United States, India has interests in curbing China's power in Asia. Well, joining us to discuss the US-India nuclear deal are our guests in Delhi, Uday Bhaskar, the former Deputy Director of the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. From Islamabad, Shireen Mazari, Director of the Institute of Strategic Studies. And in Washington, D.C., Jeffrey Lewis, Director of the Nuclear Strategy and Non-Proliferation Initiative at the New America Foundation. Thank you all for joining us. If I could start with Mr. Lewis. Is this about the U.S. perhaps trying to balance regional powers to contain each other so the U.S. remains supreme?
Well, I think that's more or less essentially what the deal is intended to do. It's kind of a 19th century geopolitical idea that one builds these strong relationships to create stable balances of power.
All right, let's go over to India and ask Mr. Bhaskar. Is India trying also to rival China's growing influence, particularly in the Indian Ocean? Is China the common denominator, perhaps, or one of the common denominators in this deal?
Not quite, Sammy, because I think the way in which India has approached this agreement of July 2005 is really to enable India to enter the global nuclear loop as far as civilian cooperation is concerned, and to remove certain penalties, fetters that were placed under US leadership after India had carried out its test in 1974, the peaceful nuclear explosion. So I don't believe that the word you used is rival China is a driver as far as India is concerned, because India's immediate objective is to come out of the denial regime that has been placed by the United States and other members of the nuclear suppliers group. I see that as the primary driver.
All right, well, coming out of the denial regime, as you put it, and let's go over to Shireen Mazari in Islamabad. But nevertheless, as it comes out of the denial regime, that's going to put pressure on neighbouring countries, including Pakistan. How is it going to be perceived there?
Oh, we perceive it clearly as a threat to the nuclear deterrence that has been stabilized to a certain level in South Asia. And we can't for the life of us understand why the United States would deliberately undermine and destabilize the nuclear deterrence at a minimum level in South Asia. We also see the deal particularly as a challenge to international law, because if the United States itself is going to undermine international treaties it has obligations under, like the NPT, Article 1 and 3.2, then how can any other state be penalized for alleged violations of the NPT? So we have a lot of problems with this deal because it's counter to international law, and it seeks to make exceptions to international law which are country specific rather than based on principles or certain general criteria.
All right, we're going to come and talk a little bit more about the issues of proliferation in a minute. I want to pick up on the points that you mentioned. Go over to Mr. Lewis once again in the United States. Earlier you talked about containment, but in reality, could this, listening to what Ms. Mazari was saying there, it could lead to, in fact, more and more escalation of the arms race in Asia, could it not?
Oh, well, I certainly think that's an outcome. I mean, the two comments we've heard, I think, illustrate two serious problems with the deal. First, from my Indian colleague, I think you get a real sense of the different expectations in the United States and in New Delhi, whereas in New Delhi, I think the emphasis is on the benefits that India will get. In the United States, there's kind of, I think, an illusory belief that this is going to result in some kind of grand strategic partnership, which I don't think will come to pass. And then in the other case, I mean, I think my colleague in Pakistan is exactly right, that in exchange for building this kind of false geopolitical balancing, what we're really doing is undermining one of the central tenets of the international institutions that maintain peace and security, which has been called the denial regime, but which I would call the non-proliferation regime. And I would just note in the long run, I actually think that will harm India's interests more. I think India is much better off as an excluded yet nuclear power in a world with very few nuclear powers than just one of many nuclear powers in an instance where you may see much greater proliferation.
All right, let's take that point to Mr. Bhaskar. It's going to undermine non-proliferation efforts and the non-proliferation regime. At the same time, you could argue, of course, that the transfer of technology is supposed to be for civilian purposes, but there's no guarantee that fuel and technology will not be used for any military purposes, is there, in the agreement?
No, Sammy, on the contrary, there is some very detailed reference to the way in which the civilian nuclear cooperation that India expects to receive, if this agreement is taken to its logical conclusion, would be regulated. So I think on that score, the negotiations between India and the United States have been, to my mind, very foolproof to ensure that there would be no quote-unquote diversion.
But there will be, sorry to interrupt you, there won't be any, there won't be regulation and safeguards on all Indian nuclear reactors. It's only 14 out of the 22. Isn't that correct, in fact?
That's right. So you're right, yeah. So, you know, what India is bringing to the table, and this is where I would like to differ with my US colleague who has made this point about India being better off as it is now, or for that matter, that the regime, the global nuclear non-proliferation regime, is better served. I'd like to suggest a contrary view, which is that if you look at the 21st century and the kind of challenges that the global community needs to address, then clearly the nuclear non-proliferation treaty as we know it, and the fact that India is outside of the treaty, is not the best arrangement. this is a point that even Dr. Al-Baradi, the Director General of the IAEA, who is currently in India, has emphasized that it would be better to have India on board as far as meeting global nuclear challenges are concerned. And purely if you were to argue this from a non-proliferation perspective, I would urge my American colleague to consider this. Today, India has the equivalent of X number of reactors, which are outside any kind of regulation. With the July 2005 agreement, what the United States is able to achieve is to bring almost 66 to 70% of these X number of reactors under international scrutiny. I would see this as a case of advancing the existing non-proliferation regime. So I think to that extent, there is a collective gain. It enables the global community and the existing nuclear powers, both weapon powers and civilian nuclear powers, to deal with the new challenge. I mean, clearly the new challenge in the 21st century is about the non-state actor, the way in which certain technologies and material have permeated, the existence of clandestine networks, and the worst case scenario, which I think every government in the world is considering very seriously, is the possibility that weapons of mass destruction, either material or know-how, fall into the hands of some very determined and extreme non-state entity that might be encouraged to use this capability.
All right, I want to jump in there. I could see Ms. Mazari shaking her head in disagreement. A collective gain? I take it you would disagree with that comment.
I have heard some bizarre logic on non-proliferation, but this is certainly the most bizarre. I mean, you destroy a regime of the NPT to bring in one particular state supposedly into that regime. It's absolutely irrational. And the point that nobody seems to be making or sidestepping is that when the United States supplies safeguarded fuel to the 8 or 14 reactors that India would eventually put under IAEA safeguards, and that, by the way, is another controversial issue. What type of safeguards would India want with the IAEA? Then what will happen is that a whole lot of unsafeguarded fuel from these reactors will be liberated for the production of even more nuclear weapons. Now, how that helps non-proliferation is mind-boggling. I mean, that logic is absurd. And there is absolutely no sense in it. Let's be very clear. This is not a deal that will further non-proliferation at all. Because it is going to allow India access to more unsafeguarded fuel to make even more nuclear weapons. And actually, if you look at the 123 agreement itself, it has no protection for India diverting from civilian to nuclear technology, the technology that it imports. People are reading the 123 agreement in tandem with the Hyde Act. But the Hyde Act is, India is under no obligation to observe what has been put in the Hyde Act. India's obligations are limited to the 123 agreement. And this is where the problem will arise eventually for the United States.
All right, it is now time for a short break. When we come back, we'll take a closer look at the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, and ask, perhaps, has it outlived its usefulness? Stay with us.